A hymnal once held in Harriet Tubman's hands, the dress Rosa Parks was sewing when she was arrested, Muhammad Ali's boxing headgear. Those artifacts and much, much more being gathered now for the planned National Museum of African American History and Culture. Our museum, our stories. Stick around for Evening Exchange. Hi, I'm Cassandra Clayton. Groundbreaking for the museum is set for this summer, but this effort has been decades in the making. Our guest tonight is hard at work collecting artifacts that will show and tell the African American experience. Welcome, Lonnie Bunch, founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Thanks so much for being here.
Oh, my pleasure.
Now, one might say there are dozens of African American museums across the country. Why do we need a national museum?
In part because a national museum means that this story is important enough to touch the millions of visitors who come to the mall. It's important because it's part of the Smithsonian, which is really the place where so many people come to learn what it means to be an American. But in many ways, what a national museum can do, it can also make sure that all the other African American museums do well. Because as more people come to this museum, who come to Washington, we can push them back to local museums. Because I think it's really important to realize that the Smithsonian has this amazing power. People come to the Smithsonian who will go to no other museum in their lives. So we want to capture that audience and encourage them to revel in African American history in their local community.
Absolutely. And someone who's coming in to visit the Air and Space Museum, come in and see and hear these stories. What would the average person get out of this experience?
Well, I think you'd get several things. On the one hand, this is a museum that'll give you a rich insider's perspective of African American culture. So you'll understand more about Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth, but it's also going to teach you about all these people you don't know. The unnamed woman who was an enslaved woman who got up every day and fed her kids before she went into the fields to make sure the field didn't strip her of her humanity. You'll hear stories of baseball players and soldiers. So on the one hand, you'll get an understanding of the culture in ways that you can't anyplace else. But on the other hand, what makes this special for all Americans is this is not a museum by black people for black people. In essence, the story of the African American, the way we want to use it, is to use it as a lens to understand what it means to be an American. So regardless of who you are, you'll understand how your notions of citizenship, resiliency, optimism, spirituality are shaped by the African American experience. So in essence, this isn't a black story. This is the quintessential American story.
Absolutely. And you have been out gathering artifacts. Tell us about some of these treasure events that you hold. How do they work?
Well, one of the things that was important to me when I came back to the Smithsonian to do this, Mayor Daley in Chicago said to me, now remember, it's hard to raise money and get people excited about a project. So I realized that, you know what, we wouldn't have a project. We'd have a museum that existed from the day I became the director. So that's what we did. We started doing exhibitions and programs. But one of the things I realized is there were a lot of African American museums around the country, many of who said, ooh, what does it mean to us when the National Museum comes to town? So we created this program called Saving African American Treasures, where what we do is we go into a community and we make arrangements with local museums so that they know we're coming, and I spend 2 or 3 days getting in front of the media, telling them the Smithsonian's coming, look at who our partners are, look at these different museums, and we ask people, almost like an antique roadshow, to bring out their stuff. And people come up in droves. And what we do as the Smithsonian is we don't tell you how valuable it is in terms of dollars, we help you preserve it. We teach you how to preserve grandma's old shawl or that wonderful daguerreotype photograph of somebody in your family who you don't know exactly who it is. We actually build the little cases for you, protect it. But what happens is people then say, well, we want to give this material to the Smithsonian. we encourage most of it to go to local museums. So we're in Chicago, the DuSable Museum gets material, or when we're in Columbia, the Charleston Museum would get it. And only if it's very special will it come back to the Smithsonian.
How many things have you collected from these treasure events? And what's something cool that you got?
Well, it's amazing to me what people bring. We've collected sort of thousands of artifacts, and one of the ones that was so special to me was a woman had a very little pin, and she wanted me to look at it, and it turned out it was a pin of Madam C.J. Walker, who was the great black beautician and early black millionaire, and it was a pin she used to give to her best workers. So it was this beautiful image of her saying, you know, you're a gifted worker, and so we'd find things that I didn't expect. But I'll tell you, the one that moved me the most was I was in Charleston, and a woman came up to me and said, would you take a look at a pillowcase? And I said, okay, I'm not really a pillowcase kind of guy, but it turned out it was a pillowcase that was stitched by an enslaved woman 2 days after she learned she was being sold from her daughter. So she stitched her daughter's name, and she said, in this pillowcase is a dress and my love. And so that really helps us understand the story of how people were being sold away, but what it meant to the mother. And according to the family, she never saw her daughter again.
Oh, that is amazing that they kept that in the family, realized the value, and now we can share that with the rest of the world.
And that's been the challenge, the wonderful joy, is that people have given us so much and shared their stories. Because in essence, my job and the job of my staff is basically to hold the people's culture in their hands. And that's a really humbling thing that we do.
Now, this museum is actually going to be an amazing structure. Let's take a look at this architectural rendering.
One of the things that was so important to me was to capture a building that would both speak of the African American experience, but would also work in Washington. So what really hit me was, if you look at the building, it's got a series of coronas. It almost looks like a crown. But where that comes from is that one day we were looking at pictures of black women in prayer, and they raised their hands in that angle, and I wanted that angle to be reflective of what the building is. So the building is really supposed to be about uplift, spirituality, resiliency. The other thing that's so powerful about it is the building is a bronze color. And so what I really want people to realize is that there's always been a dark presence in America, often neglected, not known. So now, as long as there's an America, there'll be a dark presence on the mall that'll remind us of the richness and importance of this culture through this building. And the goal is to have a building that will allow you to tell these rich, diverse stories, but also be a significant presence on the mall so that it's never seen as an afterthought, but seen as an equal contributor to all the history that the Smithsonian explores.
Welcome back to Evening Exchange. Tonight I'm with the founding director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, Lonnie Bunch. Now, you've already collected thousands of artifacts?
10,000.
10,000. Let's talk a little bit about some of the things you've gotten already. And because I love the fact that it's history and culture, so we have a little bit of everything here. A face guard from Muhammad Ali. How'd you get that?
We realize that if you're going to tell the history of African Americans in sports, you have to tell the story of Muhammad Ali.
You bet.
And we were told that there was some protective headgear that Muhammad Ali wore when he was Cassius Clay, making that transition from Olympic star to a professional. And he was trained in the Fifth Street Gym in Miami. And we heard some material was available, and we went after it. And we talked to the owners and basically acquired this wonderful piece that really can let us help the public begin to understand who Cassius Clay was and how he became Muhammad Ali.
A powder horn.
This is one of my favorite objects that we've collected. This is during the American Revolution, that they used to have the powder, the gunpowder would be in the horn. They would take it to the gun, you'd load the gun, and you'd shoot the bullet. But this is a powder horn by a black soldier who fought in the American Revolution, and he carved his name, so we actually know it's Prince Simba, and he fought in Connecticut, and he was from Glastonbury, Connecticut. So we have this whole story, and what I love about the powder horn is that on the back, he carved not just his name, but he carved a dove. And in the mouth of a dove is the word liberty. So the notion of somebody who was born a slave gained his freedom by fighting in the American Revolution, recognized how important it was for blacks to demonstrate they were worthy of citizenship by participating in that war.
From
It's
the
one of
very
my favorite
beginning.
objects.
Yes. That's how far back our history goes here.
Very much so.
Rosa Parks' dress she was selling.
One of the things that's pretty amazing to me is what we're able to find and how generous people are. And there was a wonderful collection, a sort of black fashion collection that was part of a museum in New York. And when the founder died, the founder's daughter said to me, "Are you interested in this collection?" And one of the pieces was the actual dress that Rosa Parks was working on when she was arrested at the Montgomery bus boycott, to begin the Montgomery bus boycott. So to have something that powerful is going to really be engaging for the public.
Harriet Tubman's hymnal.
Now, I'm a 19th century historian, and I didn't believe there was any material of Harriet Tubman anywhere. And I got a call from an amazing man named Charles Blockson, who was this great collector in Philadelphia. And he called me and he said that Harriet Tubman's great-great-grandniece had died and left him some material. And would I come up and take a look at it? And I have to be honest, I thought, okay, I respect this man, so I'm going to go do this, but I'm not going to find anything. Well, he took me into a library and he pulled out a box. And he pulled out first a picture of Harriet Tubman's funeral in 1912. I had never seen. Then he had some other pictures of her family. Then he pulled out this hymnal. And Harriet Tubman couldn't read, but she had a hymnal that had all the spirituals. Because you remember when she used to go into the plantations to help people escape, she would sing "Steal Away Jesus" or "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot." So to recognize that she had that hymnal for all those years allowed me to actually say, I can now tell us the story of Harriet Tubman, not as the great icon, but as a person.
A KKK banner.
One of the things this museum has to do is it has to help Americans confront their tortured racial past. So it has to be a place that will find moments of great joy, but also moments of pain. So to do that, I felt it was important that we had to collect material from those who hated. And this banner is from the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And this is the Klan that was no longer just a Southern Klan, but it was all over the place. And this is the kind of banner that was carried when the Ku Klux Klan used to march down Pennsylvania Avenue in the 1920s. Tens of thousands of Klan members would march down Pennsylvania Avenue carrying these kinds of banners. So we thought it was important to collect that as well.
Absolutely. Getting to this museum, I can tell this has been a wonderful experience for you. You just get thrilled when all of these wonderful things come in. It must be great to discover them. But we've been a long time getting to this. Efforts first started in the early 1900s.
Right. I mean, this is, by the time we open in 2015, it will be 100 years since this idea first came. And this idea really began in 1913 with the reunion of old Civil War veterans. There are old photographs of Yankees, old Yankees with beards and old rebels shaking hands. And the black community said, what about us? 200,000 African Americans fought in this war. Slavery was the cause of the war. How dare you forget us? So they began to try to create this kind of black presence on the mall. They tried before World War I, war breaks out, nothing happens. They tried again in the 20s, Great Depression, no museum. And so it really didn't come to fruition until the 1990s when people realized that, be they Democrat or Republican, that the civil rights movement transformed America. And as many of those people began to leave the scene, to die, they felt we need to document this story. That evolved into a museum that said, let us capture the story of Black America for all Americans.
How is the museum going to be laid out? We got a lot of history, we got a lot of culture.
Well, I think that's one of the great challenges is to sit down. I mean, imagine when I first started, you'd sit down and you'd say, out of all the stories that you can tell, and you only can do maybe 8, 9, 10 exhibitions, what are the stories you tell? And so what we did is we spent 2 years interviewing people, doing scientific research all over the world, trying to understand what people knew and then what they wanted. And then what I did is then married that to scholarship, to basically say, what do we as scholars think is important? And so what I was trying to find was an opportunity to give the public not just what it wants, but what it needs. And so it hit me that one of the first things we had to do was to create a part of the museum that would basically give you a narrative history from Africa to today. Because what I realize is most people don't know the African American story. And so I thought if we could give people something thematic, a narrative they can hold on to, then if they're only in the museum for a half hour or an hour, they can get that narrative and find the richness of the enslaved, of the struggle against segregation, of music and literature. And so part of it would be historical. Then there'd be a floor that would be a floor of culture that would allow us to explore music, language, art. It would allow us to give the public an understanding of how African Americans both use their culture as a bulwark to deal with racism, but also how amazing that culture was in terms of how it transformed American culture and global culture.
And then there's a part called community.
Then there's a part called community, because what I realized is that there's no single African American story. So it was really important to think about regional variations, so that at the core of the Communities Gallery would be, you would learn stories of blacks in California in the early 20th century, or growing up in Cleveland in the 1940s, or looking at what it was like to be a sharecropper in the 1890s. So it really is a goal to say, here's how you understand who we are. But even more importantly, what we did is, as part of the community, we have something called Make a Way Out of No Way, which basically says, for many people, they think that change, freedom was going to happen. And we wanted them to understand how it happened, that it wasn't an inevitable march to progress.
Okay. Now, one of the most interesting treasures that will be on display at the museum are the exquisite May Reeves hats.
May Reeves was born Lula May Grant in Vidalia, Georgia in 1912. During the summers, when school was out, she would go to Chicago. She had an uncle who lived there, stayed with the family. She had an interest in millinery, and she knew that she was not going to be able to find it in Georgia. So during the summers, she would go visit her uncle and go to the Chicago School of Millinery. She did that for 3 summers, I think, from maybe 1930 to 1934. After the final summer, she decided, I think I'm ready now to make a move to the big city. But she didn't stay in Chicago. She had a brother in Philadelphia. She came to Philadelphia, stayed with the brother, and got a job as a sales girl in a local women's shop called the Seymour's Ladies Shop. One day, her very best friend, Amanda Saunders, said, May, there's a little shop right down the street. I think you will love it for your dream hat shop. May fell in love with the shop. And at age 28 in 1940, she was able to get a $500 bank loan from the Citizen and Southern Bank, which happened to be an African American bank in the community. At that point, she became one of the first African American women to own a shop in the downtown area of Philadelphia. So people came from far and wide just to see, who is this woman, what is she doing, especially the church ladies, the socialites, other people were so happy to know that an African American woman had her own business and was also an up-and-coming hat designer. So she was a success right away. Within a few years, May's shop was so popular that whenever celebrities came to town, people like Ella Fitzgerald, Eartha Kitt, Lena Horne, they made sure they stopped by to see May. She says they would come in and sort of describe what they wanted, go off, do their shows, perform whatever they would be doing, and within a few days come back and pick up their hat and they would be back on the road again. Women often come up to me, tell me wonderful hat stories about their grandmother's hats that they still have sitting in their closet or even sometimes in the basement. And the first thing I'll say to them is, you need to pull out those hats and wear them. You need to celebrate your grandmother's life. You need to celebrate your life, because those hats are part of African American history.
Welcome back to Evening Exchange. Okay, here's an important piece of Black history I'll bet you didn't know. In the mid-1800s, the most prominent restaurant and later hotel in the city were owned by a free black man, James Wormley. The Wormley family, a long line of businessmen, educators, abolitionists, They fought in the Civil War, they fought in the Civil Rights Movement. One of Wormley's descendants joins us now in the studio, Don Graves. Thanks for coming in to be with us.
Thank you for having me.
It's such an amazing story. What was that hotel and restaurant like? I understand that presidents, generals, all kinds of important people frequented.
Well, he had actually gained his reputation well before the Civil War, back in the 1840s, as a hack and businessman in the community around Lafayette Square, and developed skills as a caterer and opened up his restaurant on 15th and I in about 1851 or 1852. And at that time, it was frequented by men like General McClellan, General Burnside, and a number of other prominent individuals of the time. And they would entertain there, and then they started having people stay in the row of houses that were there. Subsequent to that, he opened up his Grand Hotel in 1869 at the corner of 15th and H. And that hotel was known internationally. It's written up in international travel books. It was the restaurant of choice of the dignitaries in Washington. They would have banquets there. All the presidents from Lincoln going forward to Cleveland would dine there. They would have banquets there with all the Supreme Court justices. John Hay and Henry Adams actually stayed there for a long time. They stayed there when they were having their home built.
And why did they accept this black man?
Well, there were a couple of reasons. Number one, they had known the family since 1815. They had lived and worked around Lafayette Square, and they'd come to know him. In fact, there's some articles where in his hack business, and his father's hack business, he was maintaining the confidences of the politicians and the business people as they would talk in the carriages, and they knew they could count on him not to relate their stories. And then subsequent to that, he had become friends and had become trustworthy. In fact, there are many tales of the honor and integrity with which he held himself, and they knew that he would never tell anything. In fact, one of the reasons you don't hear very much about him is because of his and the family members' willingness to make sure that they maintained all the confidences. There would be politicians who would borrow money. There were stories about Mary Lincoln passing letters to her brother in the Civil War. They just came to know that he was the person that you could go to, and where all the legations would stay from all the Argentina and Italy and so forth.
That's amazing. And your family, though, had the foresight through the years to maintain some of these artifacts. You brought just a couple of things in today. I love this menu.
Certainly. This is an example of the menu from the hotel. It actually is a form menu, I guess, that came out of Boston, but inside they would paint, they printed the content, what the meal would be. It would be very similar
What was
today.
for dinner?
If you bear with me a second, I'll have to draw upon my eyeglasses. It was, raw oysters, mock turtle, consomme, chicken patties, boiled sheep's head, eggs, small potatoes, tenderloin of beef.
Okay, I'm hungry.
Yeah, duck.
Sounds wonderful.
Yes,
That's a very
absolutely.
sophisticated menu. And then you brought this in.
And these would be examples of some of the serviceware that would have. This is a small serving tray, and all of the service was done by Gorham, and it would have the name of the hotel stamped on the back of it. And it would range from very small round trays to very large trays, as large as this coffee table here. And this would be a typical water pitcher. There would be many tea services and so forth. As they said, his wine cellar was encyclopedic, and he had 15 carriages and horses in the stables as part of the hotel. He also had 3 country houses where he would raise the food that he would serve in the hotel, and it was also used to feed some of the presidents.
Just amazing. And these are the kind of stories you're hearing that most people just don't know about. Families who've saved things like this.
I think that what's so important about this story is that on the one hand, it's unique, and on the other hand, it's not. That there are hundreds of African Americans in this period who had businesses, who thrived, who found ways, despite the laws and the bigotry, to sort of live good lives and to take care of their kids and to make sure education was central to them. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity for the public to rethink what they know about black life before the Civil War.
And I think, too, some people might realize once they learn about the museum, they may realize, hey, I've got something in my attic that I might want to bring forward.
I think it's important to realize that every family has history, and every family's history shapes who we are and who we were. So it's very important that sometimes that history should go to the Smithsonian. Sometimes it should stay in the family. But the most important thing is that families need to talk to each other, preserve whatever artifacts they have, but share the stories so the stories get passed down.
Well, the opening of this museum is clearly an event and an exciting exploration of our national character. Whatever your age, whatever your ethnicity, the National Museum of African American History and Culture will have so much we can learn about our history, about ourselves. I want to thank our guests, Lonnie Bunch of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Don Graves for sharing the Wormley family story and joining us tonight on Evening Exchange. And to you, our viewers, thank you for joining us. Stay well and good night.